The classroom was silent, save for the faint tapping of a pencil against a desk. Mr. Grayson, the stern math teacher known for his scornful remarks and biting sarcasm, stood before the class, his eyes scanning the room. His gaze landed on Riley, the quiet black girl who sat at the back of the room, her face a mask of indifference. She always seemed out of place, too smart for the other kids, too quiet for their liking. Mr. Grayson hated students who didn't fit into the mold. He preferred obedience over brilliance, and Riley was anything but obedient. "Since you seem to think math is so easy," Mr. Grayson sneered, "why don't you come up here and solve this for us?" With a flourish, he picked up a piece of chalk and scribbled a complex equation across the board. Symbols and numbers that twisted into each other like an unsolvable knot. A few students shifted in their seats, whispering among themselves. Some snickered, others looked around, waiting for the drama to unfold. Riley didn't react. She didn't even look up. Her eyes were fixed on the desk in front of her, her fingers gently tapping against the wood. Her expression remained calm, her face betraying nothing. But inside something stirred. She knew this equation. She knew it well. She could solve it. But why was she hesitating? Why was she just sitting there, doing nothing? "Come on, Riley," Mr. Grayson taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. "I thought you were the smart one. Or are you too scared to show us how good you really are?" The classroom waited. All eyes were on her now. Riley's fingers tightened around the edge of her desk, the pressure building. Could she do it? Would she? But the fear that had been lurking at the back of her mind started to take hold. What if they didn't believe her? What if they laughed at her again? She had spent so long hiding her intelligence, blending into the background. She didn't want to be the center of attention. She didn't want to stand out. Not again. "Maybe I was wrong," Mr. Grayson said, his voice oozing condescension. "Maybe you're just a little too ordinary for this." He turned back to the board, confident that Riley wouldn't dare rise to the challenge. But that was when it happened. Without warning, Riley stood up from her seat, her chair scraping against the floor. The room fell into a stunned silence. She walked to the front of the class, her every step deliberate, her mind already racing ahead, calculating the problem in her head. The chalk felt cold in her hand as she took it from the tray, her grip steady, her focus unwavering. She didn't hesitate. She didn't falter. The numbers and symbols on the board seemed to flow from her fingertips. She was writing so fast, her movements almost fluid, as if she were painting rather than solving a math problem. Each equation she wrote, each step she took, was more elegant than the last. The class watched, mouths agape, as Riley worked through the problem with a brilliance they had never seen before. Mr. Grayson stood frozen, his arms crossed, his earlier smugness replaced by disbelief. "What? How?" Riley didn't respond. She simply continued. She didn't care about their opinions anymore. She didn't care about the ridicule she'd faced in the past or the labels that had been slapped on her. All that mattered now was the solution, and she knew she had it. But then, just as she reached the final part of the equation, she paused. Her hand hovered over the chalkboard. Why was she stopping? Her mind screamed at her to finish it, to show them all, to prove she was right. But something held her back. What was she afraid of? What if they looked at her differently? She erased the last few steps. The chalk squeaked as it slid across the board, erasing the truth she had just revealed. Riley turned back to face the class, her heart pounding in her chest. Her eyes met Mr. Grayson's, and for the first time, She saw doubt in his gaze. "Sit down, Riley," he said, his voice cold and dismissive. She obeyed, walking back to her seat without a word. But inside, her mind was spinning. She had just solved the equation, but why had she stopped? Why had she erased it? As she sat back down, she could feel the eyes of her classmates on her. They were confused, unsure of what had just happened. A few whispered, trying to make sense of it. Had she solved it? Or had she just made a fool of herself? The room buzzed with tension, but Riley didn't care. She wasn't sure what had just happened, either. All she knew was that she had just hidden a part of herself again. The part of her that was brilliant, the part that could solve the impossible. She had taken a step back. But why? The bell rang, signaling the end of class. As her classmates filed out of the room, they muttered among themselves, casting curious glances at Riley. She sat still, the weight of her decision pressing on her chest. What was she doing? Why was she so afraid? Was it time to stop hiding? The question lingered in her mind as the door to the classroom closed behind her. The following day, the classroom was quieter than usual. Riley sat at her desk, staring at the same notebook she had opened 100 times before. The pages were filled with sketches, random thoughts, and equations she had solved. Some advanced, others just for practice. But nothing was as important as the question that lingered in her mind. Why did she stop? It was the same equation from yesterday, the one she knew she could solve, the one that made her heart race when she first saw it. She had solved it perfectly, but then she erased the answer. Why? Was she afraid? What was she so afraid of? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Mr. Grayson's voice, cutting through the room like a knife. "Riley," he said, his tone sharp, "you'll come up here and try again. Solve the problem this time." The class seemed to freeze. Felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Riley's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't want to do it. She didn't want to face them, not again. But she knew there was no way out. Mr. Grayson had set his sights on her. He had made it clear that he wouldn't let her get away with it. Riley's hand trembled as she gripped her pencil. Her mind flashed back to yesterday, the way Mr. Grayson had mocked her in front of the class, the way the other students had whispered behind her back. It was always the same. She had always been too smart for her own good, too different, and it always made people uncomfortable. She had spent so many years hiding in plain sight, keeping her brilliance locked away like a secret. It was easier that way. Easier to just be invisible, to just blend in. But that didn't work anymore. Mr. Grayson had seen through her act. Slowly, Riley stood up. The chalkboard loomed in front of her, just like the day before. The equation from yesterday was still there, waiting for her to solve it. She walked to the front of the class, feeling the weight of every eye on her back. Her hands were clammy, but she couldn't back down now. Not in front of them. As she reached for the chalk, something unexpected happened. Zane, the quiet kid who sat 2 rows in front of her, looked up at her. His eyes were intense, but not mocking. He didn't laugh. He didn't whisper. He just watched her, waiting. And then, when Riley's hand hovered over the chalkboard, he spoke. "Why did you stop yesterday?" he asked quietly. Riley froze. For a moment, the world seemed to blur. How could he have known? Had he seen through her? Zane had always been an observer, but he never seemed interested in anyone, except for Riley. And today he wasn't mocking her like the others. He wasn't even laughing. He was simply asking a question that Riley didn't know how to answer. She forced herself to look at him. "I don't know," she whispered. "I just didn't want to show them." "Show them what?" Zane asked, still watching her with those piercing eyes. Show them that I can do it, she said, almost to herself. The silence in the room stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. Riley could feel the weight of the question in the air. What was she so afraid of? She glanced back at the equation on the board. The numbers and symbols that once seemed so daunting now felt like old friends, like something she had known her whole life. I can do this, she muttered under her breath, her hand shaking less as she picked up the chalk. Her fingers tightened around it as if it were a lifeline, guiding her through the storm inside her. But before she could write, Mr. Grayson spoke again, his voice cutting through the tension. If you can't do this, Riley, I'll be forced to move you to remedial math. I can't have a student like you wasting my time. His tone was dripping with disdain. The words stung. Remedial math, she had never been called that before. She had always been the one who was ahead of the curve, the one who others turned to for answers. But now, with Mr. Grayson's challenge, it felt different. It wasn't about the math anymore. It was about something deeper. Mr. Grayson's eyes were cold. He wasn't just trying to embarrass her. He was trying to break her. He didn't believe in her, not for a second. He didn't believe that someone like Riley could be this smart, this capable. Riley's thoughts flashed back to the times in her life when people had told her she was too much, too smart, too strange, too different. How many times had she heard those words? Too many. She had learned to shrink herself, to hide the parts of her that didn't fit in. But now, here she was, standing in front of the class with a choice. Could she hide any longer? Could she let herself be erased again? Without thinking, Riley reached for the chalk. This time, there would be no stopping, no turning back. She had spent so many years hiding, so many years pretending she wasn't what she was. But not anymore. She started writing. The chalk flew across the board, each number and symbol flowing out of her effortlessly, one after the other. Riley didn't think about the students watching her. She didn't think about Mr. Grayson's mocking gaze. All she could think about was the equation, the challenge, the answer she knew was coming. As the last numbers appeared on the board, Riley stepped back, her heart pounding. She had done it. She had solved it. But as the silence stretched out, a familiar fear settled in the pit of her stomach. Would they believe her? Zane's voice broke the silence. You did it, but Mr. Grayson wasn't done yet. I don't think so, he muttered under his breath, clearly trying to find some way to discredit her. But Riley didn't care. For the first time, she didn't care. She walked back to her seat, her heart still racing, but something inside her had changed. She had stopped hiding. Maybe it was time for everyone to see who Riley really was. Time to stop being afraid of her own genius. As the bell rang and the class began to disperse, Zane caught her eye. He nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something unspoken. Riley didn't have to hide anymore. The school auditorium was packed with students, their chatter filling the air like a low hum. The event was about to begin, the school's annual math competition, a challenge that brought together the brightest minds of the school. Riley had never been interested in competitions. She didn't like the attention, the pressure, or the judgment that came with being recognized. But today was different. She had been cornered. After Mr. Grayson's public challenge the day before, there was no way out. He had made sure to announce her participation in the competition, making it clear that she was expected to prove herself. It wasn't just about the math anymore. It had become personal. As Riley sat in the front row, waiting for the event to begin, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her heart was beating faster than it had ever beaten before. Could she really do this? Could she expose herself this way? She glanced around the room, her eyes catching a few familiar faces. Zane was sitting a few rows behind her, watching her with a knowing look in his eyes. He hadn't said much since the day before, but there was something in the way he looked at her now, something that told her he was waiting for her to do what she had always been too afraid to do. The event started, and one by one, students took the stage to face the daunting problems that had been carefully selected for the competition. Riley watched as each student walked up, attempting to solve equations on the giant chalkboard. Some struggled, others gave up. But no one seemed to have the ease or confidence that Riley had when she solved problems. It was always the same for her. No matter how difficult the math was, it never fazed her. But now it felt different. This time the whole school was watching. This time the stakes were much higher. Finally, it was her turn. Riley stood up, her legs shaky as she walked to the front of the room. Her mind raced. The familiar feeling of dread crept back into her chest. She didn't want to do this. She didn't want to be the center of attention. But she had no choice now. Mr. Grayson was at the front of the room, standing by the chalkboard, his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of contempt and curiosity. He didn't believe she could do it. He didn't think someone like her could be capable of the kind of brilliance he had witnessed yesterday. It was clear that he had no respect for her abilities, and that made Riley even more determined. "Go ahead," Mr. Grayson said, his voice cold. "Let's see what you can do." The room fell silent as Riley approached the chalkboard. She had seen the problem before. It was a complex equation that no one had yet been able to solve. But Riley didn't see it as a challenge. She saw it as a puzzle, one that was just waiting to be solved. She picked up the chalk and began writing. The numbers and symbols appeared on the board with a fluidity that surprised even herself. She was in the zone. She didn't think about the audience, the pressure, or the judgment. All that mattered was the math. And as she worked, the tension in the room seemed to dissipate. The first few lines of the equation were easy, too easy for someone like Riley. But as the problem grew more complicated, Riley's hand slowed, just for a moment. She felt the weight of every eye in the room on her. Mr. Grayson was watching her closely, his arms crossed. He was waiting for her to make a mistake, waiting for her to falter. But Riley didn't falter. She kept writing, pushing through the complexity of the equation with a calm focus. The students in the audience began to whisper among themselves. Could it be? Could she really do this? As the last number appeared on the board, Riley stepped back, her heart pounding. She had done it. She had solved the problem. The entire room was silent for a few seconds, as though no one could believe what they had just witnessed. Mr. Grayson stepped forward, his face unreadable. He examined the equation, his eyes scanning the solution. For a moment he said nothing. The tension in the room was thick, as everyone waited for him to say something, anything. Finally he spoke. "This isn't just right. This is something else." His voice was soft, almost to himself, as if he couldn't quite believe it. He turned to the audience. "This isn't just a solution. This is a breakthrough." The room erupted into whispers, then applause. But Riley didn't feel the satisfaction she thought she would. The fear, the doubt, the hesitation. It was still there, lingering in her chest. She had done it, yes, but she wasn't sure why it felt so empty. As the crowd continued to cheer, Riley felt a tap on her shoulder. It was Zane. He had made his way to the front of the room, standing beside her as the students celebrated her achievement. "You did it," he said quietly, his voice full of awe. But Riley didn't answer. She wasn't sure what to say. She hadn't done it for the applause or the recognition. She had done it because she had no other choice. She had done it to prove something to herself, not to anyone else. Mr. Grayson was still standing by the board, staring at Riley's solution with an unreadable expression. He had been wrong, and for the first time Riley felt a strange sense of triumph. Not because she had won, but because she had finally stopped hiding. The final bell rang, signaling the end of the competition. The students began to file out of the auditorium, still talking excitedly about Riley's performance. But she stayed behind, staring at the chalkboard. She had exposed herself. She had revealed her brilliance to the world. But what now? Was it really worth it? She looked over at Zane, who had stayed behind with her. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that told her this was just the beginning. "Are you ready?" Zane asked, his voice soft but steady. Riley didn't answer immediately. She looked at the chalkboard once more, then turned to face him. "I think I'm ready now," she said, her voice full of resolve. And for the first time, she believed it.